Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon to wherever you are. My name is Farha Abdulhaq, and I'm joining you all now today, this evening from Jeddah, the coastal city in Saudi Arabia. I welcome you all to this interesting webinar where we would be discussing models for identifying intellectual property and how, as a business, you can strategically manage intellectual property and how at the end you can monetize your intellectual property as you take your business to the next level. We have, I know, toward the session, we would be taking your question towards the end. I'll be introducing my guest shortly. I would want you to share your questions toward the end to our Twitter, Facebook. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker today. We have Mr. Ogwang from Kenya. So he's fondly known by his clients and friends alike as Triple O. He's one of Africa's leading intellectual property voices. He's a Kenyan-born intellectual property law practitioner with 9 years of experience. He's also the managing partner and principal at the Institute of Intangible Resource and Awareness, which is a fully owned subsidiary of Triple O and Associates. Without further ado, Mr. Ogwang, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Faha. Thank you very much.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing quite well. Kenya is lovely. How are you doing in Middle East?
Oh, it's kind of we're in a month of Ramadan. It's almost we're ending the day, and it's kind of hot today, but it's really great to join you all together on this session, and I just can't wait to start off. So, Mr. Ogwang, coming from your background, you have wrote extensively and studied extensively on intellectual property, and this is something. As entrepreneurs or students, we understand, but we don't quite know how we would be, what it means for our business in general. So could you shed light on what we should understand by intellectual property? And why should I have an intellectual property strategy as a startup or as a large established company? If you can shed some light.
Thank you very much, Faha. First and foremost, I would wish to issue this disclaimer out there that nothing that I will say in this forum should actually be taken to mean legal advice. In any subsequent advice that anyone might have, I would gladly advise you that you check with the legal practitioners in your respective jurisdictions so that you can actually get the right legal advice, so to speak. Intellectual property is one of those fundamental areas of interest, especially for an entrepreneur who is considering venturing into entrepreneurship, either directly or indirectly. Intellectual property, every individual has a form of intellectual property. Whether the individual is aware or not, every one of us, we have one form or another of intellectual property. It's just like the appendix in the human body. Most of us don't even know that we have an appendix. Even scientists themselves, they are not quite sure what role does an appendix play in the human body. Equally, every individual with a head is a candidate of intellectual property. It's only that a few of us, we have gone, and through curiosity, we have gone out there to ask and to explore, what is this thing and what can I take advantage and how can I benefit out of it as an individual? So to that extent, I would actually wish to offer us with a working definition of intellectual property, a working understanding of intellectual property. Whether you're in career, as you could be a career sports person, whether you're in entertainment, whether you're in fashion, whether you're in direct employment, whether you're a student, or whether you are an entrepreneur or someone in freelance or someone in self-employment. All of us, we have different forms or diverse forms of intellectual property. Intellectual property is the creation of the human mind. That is the most basic definition of intellectual property that I would actually wish that all of us we adopt as a working definition of intellectual property. But with that definition equally, we have variations of understanding as far as intellectual property is concerned, and the different variations of awareness and understanding and appreciating intellectual property is actually important. And I would wish to actually give us a few variations of intellectual property. There is what it's called a legal definition of intellectual property. And the interest of people in the legal practice, as far as intellectual property is concerned, might slightly be different to the interest of different people in intellect that have different interests, that have different approaches as far as intellectual property is concerned. So the legal definition of intellectual property, and in a matter of time, we would actually begin to appreciate the reason why there are different variations of intellectual property and how as an individual, regardless of where you are in life, how as an individual, you can either appreciate a variation and see how it can serve you best, or you can actually pick and choose which other variation actually helps you. The legal understanding or the legal interest on intellectual property is that intellectual property is that creation of the human mind and the rights, duties, and privileges that come from such work. So when in a very unfortunate circumstance where we have legal disputes, people the interest of courts as far as the matter that is being adjudicated upon is concerned, they will always ask this: who created that and who has a right to that? And so in intellectual property, as far as the legal practitioners are concerned, we will always say that intellectual property rights, because as a legal practitioner, as an individual in court, or as a judge, or as a lawyer to either of the parties, or as an individual who is trying to expand jurisprudence, and jurisprudence is just the philosophy around the practice of intellectual property, more often than not, we are primarily interested with who created what, and at what point do they share rights, at what point do they share privileges under that thing that they had created. So that is the legal definition of intellectual property. Then there is the scholarly or the academic interest in intellectual property. And as far as academia is concerned, intellectual property is the creation of the human mind and the acknowledgements that come from such work. And that is why, especially most of us in this forum who are in the academic space, either as students or we are in the academic infrastructure or in the institutions of academia, you will always wish to attach what you have created, either as an academic paper or your academic project or your thesis. You will always attach that in furtherance or in going about putting together this body of work, so and so helped me in this way. That acknowledgement, in as much as in certain areas they are called credits, but that acknowledgement is actually intellectual property form. That intellectual property in academia, intellectual property in the space of knowledge and in the space of education, intellectual property is concerned with who created what, right, and the acknowledgements that issue from such works. Then the last variation of definition that I wanted us to appreciate is the entrepreneurial interest in intellectual property. And in entrepreneurship, the interest is this: that intellectual property is the creation of the human mind and with an interest of commercialization. So as an entrepreneur or as an individual in whichever space that you are, that you find yourself in, if you wish to appreciate that approach of what markets, what commercial interests are in this thing that I've created, then I would actually ask all of us to try and adopt that working definition of intellectual property. And it is this, that intellectual property is that creation of the human mind and with an interest of commercialization. So that means if I have come up with an academic paper, if I have come up with a project, so to speak, the question that would actually be in my mind as a practitioner within this space is, what market can come out of this? And if you actually look at the huge mismatch, the huge point of disconnection between the marketplace, and because we are, yeah, most of us, I'm trying to imagine that we come from the African continent, there is a huge disconnection between the African classroom and the African marketplace, because most of us, we have never appreciated that knowledge is actually proprietary. That word proprietary should not actually scare you. The word proprietary simply means what aspect of ownership, that anything that you create, what aspect of it can you as an individual own? What aspect of it can you actually stake a claim on? So that huge mismatch between the African classroom and the African marketplace exists because we have never understood that intellectual property, as far as academia is concerned, that intellectual property can actually be converted into a raw material. Intellectual property can actually be viewed as, regardless of which space that you wish to approach this conversation from, intellectual property is a resource. So foundationally, for us to appreciate, and I would really wish to hope that many people who are in this forum are actually people engaged in economic generating ventures, which we would call actually business. I would wish that we appreciate this definition, that whatsoever I am creating, whatsoever my organization has, what market can come out of it? What market can come out of my expertise? If I am a coder and I'm developing lines of code, the question that I should be asking is, can a market come out of this? And if a market, if you can only prove that from where you live in your locality, you can identify 10 people alone that can consume whatever you're offering at the fee that you're offering it, then that is validation enough that you can actually develop an entire industry around whatsoever you are doing. So the interest of intellectual property, as Faha had asked, what should we as individuals and what should we as people begin to appreciate about intellectual property? The thing that most of us should actually begin to appreciate about intellectual property is that every one of us has one form or another of intellectual property. That all of us, the thing that you have, that the thing that I could be having over and above my peers, the thing that I could be having either as a skill, either as knowledge, information, either as an expertise, either as an experience, either as a talent, that thing that you have, that thing that you can effortlessly do, that thing is the beginning point of your intellectual property. Intellectual property, again, is that creation of the human mind with an interest of commercialization. But up to that point, why is it that most of us, we seem not to appreciate, or most of us, we seem not to be aware of our intellectual property? And let me, at that point, let me begin to introduce this other conversation, that intellectual property, especially for us who are at the marketplace, especially for us who are trying to grow our market spaces, especially for us who are trying to grow our value proposition, and us who are trying to develop a market and develop a dedicated consumer base around whatsoever we are doing, it's important for us to appreciate that intellectual property appears at two levels. The two distinct levels, especially for an individual that is at the marketplace, is at this: intellectual property can be artificial and intellectual property can be natural as an individual. And to that point, let me introduce us to this conversation. Under the law, there are three types of people. The law gives space for an individual called an artificial person. And an artificial person is a person that is founded under the law, either as an organization, as a corporation, as a non-governmental organization, as an institution. That is a person under the law. The other type of person under the law is called a natural person. A natural person is you and I, that we were conceived in the wombs of our respective mothers and we came into existence through birth. That from conception all the way to death, we have natural existence. Equally, artificial people or artificial persons under the law, they have a date of formation and a date that they are wound up. Your organization, that entity that you're driving, that entity that you're running, that business that you're trying to put up, that concept that you're trying to come up with, can actually find its own expression under the law as an artificial person. Now, why am I arriving at that point? It's because an artificial person in law, in as much as they don't have blood, in as much as they can't sweat, but an artificial person under the law has certain rights that can mirror the rights of a natural person. So under the law, an artificial person can own something. Under the law, an artificial person can express itself. Under the law, an artificial person can have the right to either give or to enter into contract, enter into engagement, enter into agreement. The reason why I'm taking this part for us, even to begin appreciating the different and diverse appearance of intellectual property, is that business you're running, it has diverse forms of intellectual property. The part of intellectual property that your organization has might be slightly different from those kinds of intellectual property that you could be having as an individual. Because as an individual, you have talent, you have expression of talent. As an individual, you have expression of ideas. As an individual, you have expression of desires. Well, let me tell you what, even the organization that you are trying to run, that business that you're trying to put up, let me tell you, that business equally has its own interest. That business equally has its own desires. That business equally has its own things that it can own. So, in us, especially driving and growing entrepreneurial practices, in us growing entrepreneurial cultures, especially in Africa, and guess what, my friends? Entrepreneurship is one of the most fundamentally amazing phenomenon of our time. That today I can develop a concept, I can come up with a product, I can come up with a service, that service can be sold on the other side of the globe. That today I can come up with a value proposition. So in us appreciating that, then it's the duty of an entrepreneur, you and I, who are trying to build and who are trying to grow our market spaces. It's your duty, it's my duty to begin asking myself, am I fully exploiting the intellectual property components in my business? Am I fully exploiting the intellectual property aspect in my business development? Am I fully appreciating the intellectual property in something as significant as the name of your business? Is something as insignificant that we might regard as insignificant as the color in your business? In something as insignificant in the reputation and the goodwill around your business? Let me tell you this, my friend. Every single moving piece of your business is actually a resource. It can be something as basic as customer acquisition. It can be something as basic as business or product development processes. The duty of an entrepreneur, and if at all we wish to grow entrepreneurship around the African continent, the kind that can actually position the African continent to compete aggressively at the global marketplace, then we need to come to a point whereby as entrepreneurs, we are reinforcing the unique components in our organizations as well as the unique components in the people that are driving these organizations, because these are two types of people that are running or are driving the same agenda. Back to the conversation at hand. How can we manage our different forms of intellectual property to grow businesses? That today in my space and today in what I'm doing, can intellectual property provide me with a resource? Can that awareness, what we call intellectual property awareness, the ability to know that if I am good as a songwriter, then that songwriting skill that I have, that is actually my intellectual property. If I am a salonist and that skill that I have, that skill is actually my intellectual property. That if I am a chef or I'm good at cooking, my recipe is actually intellectual property. That if I am a writer and my sense of developing stories, my sense of characterization, that is actually intellectual property. Then it's actually your duty as an individual. It's actually my duty as an individual to see how far we can grow that entire conversation, to see how far we can grow and we can stretch the business that can come out of every single moving piece in everything that we are doing. So let me see if we can just pan it and position that conversation and see how that is now relevant to all of us. The largest hotel in the world does not even have one building, Airbnb. And Airbnb is merely exploiting intellectual property that it has in the business model that Airbnb has come up with. The largest taxi company in the entire world does not even have one fleet, Uber. But Uber is actually exploiting the intellectual property components in their own business model. We are living in a time that we are redefining entrepreneurship. We are living in a time that we are trying to come up from traditional business models that people actually used to develop whatever they were doing. Now, the challenge that entrepreneurs have in our time, the challenge that you have is, how then can I inject my individuality? How then can I inject my skills? How then can I inject my talent in advancing my business venture, in advancing my entrepreneurial interest? There must be a point upon which these two things come together. The point at which they come together is what it's called proprietary awareness. And as we had said earlier, that term proprietary is not a big word. That term proprietary simply means that in the thing that you're doing, right? What components can you own in that thing that you're doing? Do you own the name of your business? Do you own the business processes in your office, in your organization? How do you initiate contact with a client? How do you initiate a point of with a prospect? How do you shoot your email? Have you identified that the way that you're shooting your email, as far as you can establish that it is slightly unique from from your peers or from people around you, then the way you're shooting your email is actually proprietary, is actually your intellectual property. Intellectual property can be something as simple as a color. Do you actually know that the shade of red that Coca-Cola uses, do you know that Coca-Cola has used its color? So in us approaching and in us trying to segment appreciation of intellectual property, then we really need to appreciate the different features that intellectual property helps us to, so as to segment whatever we're doing. There is a feature of intellectual property called copyright. And copyright is that resource that is trapped in that physical enactment of whatever you've done. Have you come up with a song? That song actually originates and extends your aspects of copyright. Let me tell you this. Intellectual property is slightly unique because intellectual property is one of those things called voluntary right, that as an individual, I can voluntarily choose to either reinforce or to either exploit my forms of intellectual property. Intellectual property cannot help an individual as far as we are talking about intellectual property rights. Intellectual property does not help an individual when your idea is here. As far as when it comes to instances of litigation and going for adjudication in court, intellectual property will not help you if it's merely here. Then you as an individual needs to learn how to convert that idea, because the foundation base of every intellectual property is an idea. The world out there is run by entrepreneurs. The world out around there and everything around our civilization and the way we have structured our livelihood, everything is structured around entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs run this place. Why? Because an entrepreneur will come up with an idea and an entrepreneur will follow up that idea until an entrepreneur converts that idea into an industry, into a service, into a market, into a product, into a sector of an economy. The world around us is run by entrepreneurs, people who are bearing ideas. So that means that as an individual, it's my duty to actually begin to understand the expression of my creativity and to begin to appreciate that the way I'm expressing creativity is actually my intellectual property. My voice is my intellectual property. If that voice can be captured, then that voice, if I'm a painter, that aspect of painting, how is it that Vincent van Gogh died very many years ago, but his paintings still fetch 50 million US dollars? But how is it that a friend of mine who lives just a stone throw away from my house, his painting nearly fetches peanuts? It's because in the Vincent van Gogh's painting, they have identified intellectual property components in that painting. And so the components around the painting reinforces the value of that thing that Vincent van Gogh did. So intellectual property can be trapped up in that thing that you can condense. Are you a storyteller? Are you a musician? Are you a chef, or are you good at cooking? If you can develop something unique about your cooking and you can identify the unique component, how you're putting things together, then that is the initiation, that is the foundation base of your forms of intellectual property. Intellectual property might be intangible. You cannot touch it. Can you touch color? Can you touch color? Not unless it's in a paint, but can you merely touch color? Can you touch a story? Can you touch a song? Can you touch the emotions that songs evoke? Can you touch goodwill? Thus are some of those aspects that can be trapped in what it's called as a copyright. So a copyright is a right that actually exists in anything that is literal, a song, a book that you're putting together. Are you a storyteller? Do you know that you can own your storytelling skills? Do you know that you can actually create a universe from your story and actually use that universe that you've actually created? Most of us who appreciate movies, right? I appreciate movies. There is a franchise called the James Bond franchise. The James Bond franchise is actually owned. They own the Bond name, James Bond. They actually own that. The challenge that we have, especially with the African storytellers, is that we are very passive when it comes to creating stories. We don't even, we come up with generic names, right? That you are developing a story and your cast is called Peter. You can't own Peter. Your cast is called James. You can't own James. Your cast is called Mary. And the story is set up in Lagos, Nigeria. You can't own Lagos. Lagos is already owned by the government. Your story is in Kuala Lumpur. You cannot own that, right? But those of us who can come up with stories, and we are very deliberate at how we are coming up with stories, guess what? You can own your story. You can own the universes that you've created through your stories. Are you a songwriter? Do you know that the way you are approaching composition, the way you are approaching songwriting, and the way you are approaching your craft, do you know you can actually own that? right? So intellectual property is in everything, as long as you and I, we are deliberate. As long as you and I at the marketplace, we are very deliberate with what we are doing, that we are not merely doing this. I get slightly disturbed when musicians come and you engage with a musician and you're like, man, if you only knew what can come out of your song, if you're slightly deliberate with your composition and how you're putting together your song structure, everything is proprietary. If there is anything that I would want you to move from this session with, is to know this, that I have intellectual property. Everything about my expression, everything about my creativity, everything about my knowledge, everything about my skill, everything about my talent, everything about my individuality, how I laugh, how I smile, how I talk, how I walk, is actually intellectual property. One of my favorite rappers of all time said, I am not a businessman, I am a businessman. That means that if you are just a little deliberate with yourself, if you're just deliberate with the knowledge that you have grasped, you have gleaned through the process of academia, that information that you're putting out there, do you actually know that you should actually own it? If in that paper that you wrote, the knowledge that you are advancing there, every moving piece about business and about how you are going about your business, it doesn't matter. You could be selling charcoal, it doesn't matter. You could be a tailor. How is it, and this is amazing, how is it that major fashion designers are not even tailors? And I'll always ask people who can tailor, people who can stitch, do you not know that just from your stitch, if you're a little deliberate with coming up with designs, the initial shot was not this, right? But this individual owns a component that they have brought into this. So chances are they begin from owning that design. So today, if you're an individual with creative expression, that creative expression can actually be your form of copyright. That form of copyright is actually a resource that today, if you can just stitch, if you can just sketch something, that's something that you can sketch actually in a very progressive economy. That thing that you have sketched should actually, if you're seeking for investment, or you're seeking for funding, or you're seeking for loan or credit, that in a very progressive economy should actually cover up for your costing. Intellectual property, my friend, is the next frontier of competition. Intellectual property is trapped. Let me ask you this. Uh, Growing up, we used to have these strange people when I was young. I'm slightly advanced in age, but growing up, I used to have friends in our class that if they would call you a name, that name would stick for a while. And it was just something, and some of them still have it today. They will call someone a name and that name sticks. They will come up with a phrase and that phrase sticks. Have you heard of that phrase, taste the feeling? Taste the feeling. Have you heard of that phrase? Are you aware that actually organizations buy slogans? And most of us, we don't even appreciate that skill that you have, that gift that you have, that expression of your creativity can actually create an economy out there for you. That if you can come up with a phrase, and that's why I'm saying, what the other feature of intellectual property is something called a trademark or a service mark. What is known about you as an individual? What is known about your reputation? What is it about you that have people interested, have people excited? What is it about you or about your business that has people excited? What is it about you that will always have people flocking around you? That is your goodwill, right? Do you know that actually your goodwill is actually your intellectual property? That in this forum, we just wish to explore variations of intellectual property so that I can actually peel your eyes to begin to appreciate that everything about you as a skill is actually your raw material. That if you have a gift of coming up and putting together phrases, do you know that the English language is made up of million words, but there are people who are exceptionally gifted at putting together phrases. Are you aware that that is your intellectual property? There are people today that they're very good at humming melodies. Are you aware that that is intellectual property? Actually, in Africa, us guys are purely melodical. That is our intellectual property. So, intellectual property can be something that you are known for. And when it's something that you're known for, and you're using that thing that you're known for actively engaged in your marketplace, guess what? That's your trademark. So, a trademark or a service mark is any mark that identifies one person's product at the marketplace, one person's service at the marketplace, whatever you're offering. There are two, even if you go to whichever sector, if you go into banking, what differentiates bank A from bank B? Their name, right? Their color, right? Their logo, right? All those are forms of intellectual property that you as an individual can begin to grow awareness around. That you as an individual can begin to ask yourself, why is it that people like buying from us? Would people buy from me if my corporate color was this? Would people buy from me if my mantra was different from this? Are people attracted to my mantra? Are people attracted to what I'm doing because of this thing that I'm doing? It is you to begin defining in whichever space that you appear. It's for you to begin defining. I'm reminded of an incident when COVID started. There's a gentleman from South Africa that came up with it was like a product the gentleman came up with, and it was for bus stops, the bus termini. And when I came across it was he turned these drums into places where people would wash their hands, and the story ran that this is for bus termini in Africa. And when I came across it, my mind just went to, this gentleman has literally created another industry altogether, but the gentleman is not even aware. So the conversation around intellectual property is this: how then can I convert my menu, my ingredient, my recipe? How do I convert it into an entire industry? Right? Most of us, especially in Nairobi, we have KFC joints. And I always ask people, do you think KFC is in Nairobi? And people are like, yes, KFC is in Nairobi. And I'm like, no, KFC is not in Nairobi. KFC is actually exploiting the proprietary aspect of their menu, and they are exploiting that through their color, and they are literally littered around Nairobi. I always ask people, Coca-Cola, is Coca-Cola in Africa? Yes, Coca-Cola might be in Africa operationally, but guess what? Coca-Cola, actually, they're telling us the secret. In the bottle, they're saying made under Coca-Cola license. Why? Coca-Cola actually created an entire business model around their trade secret, their formula. Everything about an entrepreneur, any individual that is actively engaged in whichever market space you find yourself. And that one actually makes me define for us who is an entrepreneur. We have these definitions of who is an entrepreneur. And we have that an entrepreneur is an individual that assumes risk in furtherance of realizing a profit. And I'm like, no, that's not the definition of an entrepreneur. This is the definition that I would want you from today moving forward. And I can tell you for free, you will never get this definition anywhere. This is actually our definition when we do trainings. This is an entrepreneur. An entrepreneur, and if you're writing, you could write an entrepreneur. just acknowledge that it was from Ogwang and just have the quotes. An entrepreneur is any individual. Remember, we had said that there are three types of people under the law. There is an artificial person, and then there is a natural person. Okay. An entrepreneur is any individual or an organization that has developed a new product or a new service or a new value proposition within an existing market structure. So then that would mean if you are fully to qualify to be an entrepreneur, then you are merely operating within an existing market structure. So who is a businessman? And most of us, we say that, hey, how is it that we distinguish that that individual is a businessman, that individual is an entrepreneur? While on the face of it, we might actually think that they are one and the same. No, a businessman, this is what a business is. A business is any economic generating venture, right? That does not require the presence of the owner, shareholders, or the founders for it to run. And that's why Aliko Dangote is a businessman. The Dangote Group runs even without his participation in whichever market space. For us to fully begin to appreciate dimensions of entrepreneurship, it's important if you and I can begin to come up with working definition, working understanding of some of these things. And in whichever market space, the interest of an entrepreneur is always to operate within an existing market structure. Facebook did not invent social media. Social media existed, right? But Facebook is actually within that market structure we call social media. So intellectual property helps to give an entrepreneur an awareness that if I was to approach it, I could be in direct employment. Then there is this component of what I'm doing that can actually be exploited to this extent. That is actually the duty and responsibility of every entrepreneur. It's my duty as an individual growing my venture. It's my duty as an entrepreneur growing my market space to begin asking myself, could there be resources in my business or in me as an individual that as at now I'm not exploiting? Could there be those things that as at now either I'm trying to either not appreciate, either I'm assuming, because that is what is our challenge at the marketplace. That in the African marketplace, we are so much used to traditional models. Let me show you this. When our African commodities, and the reason and the way the market is structured in Africa is purely on commoditization. What is a commodity? A commodity is that service that 10 other people can provide. If you're selling charcoal in a market of charcoal, it's a charcoal commodity, right? The challenge that we have with Africa is that we are merely competing with our peers, the West and the Orientals, and we are merely competing with them from a point of commodity, while they are competing with us from a point of proprietary products. China began as a country that was merely copycats, but today China has converted, and there is no country under the sun that is filing for patents like China in a year. Why? Because China has realized that for it to grow strategic and competitive business models, China needs to appreciate proprietary design around their intellectual property. Intellectual property, and I'm merely hoping this is a very wide conversation that in order for all of us to exhaustively and comprehensively actually dispense with, we need to go base segment by segment. Intellectual property, and I just wanted to spark this conversation even as I'm about to bring Faha. I just wanted us to create this awareness that you as an entrepreneur, you as an individual, you could be having your forms of intellectual property. Your soccer skill is your intellectual property. Have you exploited the name that you're using? Have you exploited your pseudonym? Are you a musician? Just today, I was engaging with a dancer and asked this lady, do you choreograph? And she asked me, what is that? I asked her, your dance move, are they somewhere coded that you can actually describe your dance move? And I told the lady, if you can do that, your dance move can actually create for you an economy out there, an industry out there. My last position is this. Intellectual property is with everyone. It's your duty, it's my duty to give myself to my idea. It's your duty, it's my duty to give myself to my product and begin asking myself, what other thing can come out of this thing I'm doing? Whatever you're doing, as at now, kindly don't view it as an end result. It is not an end in itself. Whatever you're doing as at now is merely an opener to expose you to all that your idea can develop. Faha.
Oh, wow, Mr. Thank you so much, Mr. Ogwang, for helping us kind of understand and appreciate and decipher what it means uh, while giving us examples of China, Facebook, Airbnb. Just want to shift the conversation a bit further now.
Okay.
Um, how do you feel that intellectual property, how can it promote economic development of countries like Kenya, Nigeria, and do you feel that there are enough IP protection policies in place for businesses in Africa? And my second question would be regarding COVID. So during this
Okay.
pandemic, if I'm an entrepreneur who could potentially create a testing kit, let's say for
Okay.
example, um, how do you balance between making these scientific medical tools available quicker to a wider population, but yet manage to have a proper IP protection? So if you can shed some light on that, it will kind of help our viewers understand. And I would like to remind our viewers that you can send in questions through Twitter and YouTube, and we'll be taking them shortly, all right?
That's a very beautiful question, Faha. How can a country particularly take advantage of intellectual property? And it's very beautiful because in Africa, our countries have not actually appreciated appearance of intellectual property. That we have cultures. The people of Nigeria, their culture is proprietary. The people from Senegal, their culture is proprietary. Today, the most sought after medical procedure anywhere in the world is a Chinese culture. It's called acupuncture. And you know, actually, China is selling acupuncture. Karate is a Chinese culture. Do you know
Right.
that for a country to participate at the Olympics, we pay China, we pay Japan? When someone participates in judo, do you know we pay Korea? When people dance salsa, do you know as a country, you cannot do anything industrial on salsa because salsa is actually people's culture. So the thing that, especially even as we moving forward in growing our distinct aspects of our individuality as countries, we should actually begin to ask ourselves, and the question, and it's a beautiful question, that we cannot divorce a country defining itself from policy. What is fundamentally lacking in corporate Africa is that we are lacking enabling policies, programs, and initiatives that reinforce intellectual property, enabling policies that are actually helping people to grow and to expand their intellectual property. The challenge that we have, and that I've observed, is most of our policies are very limiting, so to speak, that if I'm in an organization and I do this, then my organization owns it. And that is equally a policy in law. And that's why I'm saying that it's high time we began to review some of our policies and ask ourselves where we are going as a country, where we are going as a continent. And it's important for us even to ask ourselves, where does my contribution as an individual, how does it fit in Agenda 2063? Where does my practice as a legal practitioner, do I see my practice fitting in Agenda 2063? Then we begin to work backward and ask ourselves, if we were to bring everyone on board, what enabling policies do we need to put in place? That was a very brilliant question. Another question about COVID and the innovation around COVID is that innovation has never actually been appreciated as a form of resource. Africa is full of innovative solutions. Guys are constantly coming up with a new way of doing something. Guys are coming up with the new ways of meeting a challenge. Guys are coming up with a new way. The challenge that most of us, we especially, and that is the duty of the individual, the duty of the individual coming up with the innovation, it's your duty to ask yourself, in this thing that I'm trying to come up with, what are the proprietary components? And that word proprietary component, the word proprietary, if anyone should forget anything about what we have discussed today, don't forget this phrase, proprietary. The thing that you're doing, ask yourself, what is proprietary? What is that thing that is uniquely that I can use today to get funding? What is that thing that I can use in this innovation that I've come up with that today I can have investors investing in that thing?
Right.
Uber was an investment. Google was an investment because all these people came up with proprietary design. Yes, Faha.
Yes. So I would like to take some questions now from the audience. We have, I'm sorry, we could only allow you 30 to 1 minutes to answer them if you can. So it's, so Simba is asking, is intellectual property a hard concept to master for African artists?
By
Thank you.
African artist, do I respond or I just wait for the rest?
No, you can respond. You may respond.
But by an African artist, am I asking for someone who is in sculpture, someone who is carving, or by an African artist, am I talking of musicians? By an African artist, am I talking of a painter? Every aspect of your artistry is intellectual property, is the simplest thing that you can actually appreciate. My background is actually in music production. I've been producing music now for the past 24 years. And one of those things that most of us people, especially in the entertainment space, that we have never quite appreciated is that entertainment in itself is proprietary. Everything about music is proprietary. How do you sing? How do you develop music? How do you come up with your phrases? How do you structure your songs? How do you structure your delivery? Everything is intellectual property. Let me ask you this. How is it that Africans, we picked rap from the Americans, but we left the business component from the Americans? That we left it with the Americans? That we are very good rappers in Africa, but guess what? We are very broke. Is because there is a component about art that while we were trying to copy music from the Americans, in the context of artistry, that we copied music, the model that most of us left was the business model. Business model is actually intellectual property. How do you go about your career? How do you go about your career as a DJ? Do you own your name as a DJ? Do you have a skill, your cutting skill that as a DJ you can own? As a producer, do you own? Dr. Dre is virtually one of the most successful producers of all time. Dr. Dre owns his name. Dr. Dre owns his drum patterns. Everything about art is intellectual property. Yes, Faha.
Well, thank you for that. So we have a next question on screen. How do I monetize intellectual property if I'm a service product or information product provider to grow my business? Let's say Opportunity Desk, for example. If I have a webinar or we have an article or a news, how do I do that?
First and foremost, we need to appreciate that the service industry is purely driven on knowledge. It's purely driven on skill, expertise. Guess what? Your knowledge is actually your resource. The challenge is, can I convert that knowledge into a product? What is it about Opportunity Desk that as at now we have not yet explored? Have we, in the way we have structured our conversations, is there a particular formula? Is there a particular trend in all our conversations? What are we really after? If we can define that thing that we are really after, then it's our responsibility now to package it into a product. The challenge that I always toss to people in the space of service. Most of us, we are very generic at how we go about our service. We are very generic at how we approach our ventures. We are very generic at how we approach our craft. To that extent of us being generic, then we are taking out of that component of intellectual property. So, how do you structure your program? How do you term your program? Do you have a framework around your program? That framework around your program is actually your intellectual property. Have you read a book called Rich Dad Poor Dad?
Yes.
Everyone has read Rich Dad Poor Dad. What is Robert Kiyosaki selling in that book? One thing, cash flow quadrant. The entire book can be reduced to that thing, cash flow quadrant. So to Robert Kiyosaki, the entire conversation, and he will say rich dad, poor dad for this, rich dad, poor dad for investors, rich dad, poor dad for real estate. And the only thing that Robert is actually pushing is actually the cash flow quadrant. Why? Because Robert has developed a proprietary model around his framework. If you're an individual and you're selling knowledge, you're selling information, the first thing that you should own as an individual is to own your framework. And how then do you go about naming your program? How then do you go about structuring and tailoring that program? So from there, then you can package it into a product. Yes, Faha.
Okay, so we have next question. Lawal is asking, what is the nexus between intellectual property law and the pursuit of a green future?
That's a beautiful question. It's because intellectual property is that thing that is actually creating the green future. Green future is a concept. Let me shock you. There's a gentleman that in Kenya that passed a few years ago. This gentleman literally created the phrase ozone layer. That phrase ozone layer. He's called Professor Oumuga. That gentleman passed on. Today, people are generating billions of dollars in funding from that phrase, the ozone layer. So the future of green energy, the green future is actually, it's something that we are crafting. Intellectual property helps the people within this space to actually own components of the operations, that this is my contribution in this space, and I appreciate that to this extent I can own this component of that. Everything around us is framed around ideas. Do you understand your idea? What can come out of your idea? If I hand you let me say, if I hand you a 2 kg packet of wheat flour, and the only thing you know how to make is muffin, every time I'll be handing you 2 packets of wheat flour, you'll always be coming up with muffin. So if I hand the same to an individual that knows how to make muffins and to bake cakes and to make biscuits, guess what? The possibilities around that is actually determined by the extent of your resource. The only resource as an entrepreneur, especially the friend who has asked about the green space, is because as at now, it's not yet defined. As at now, it's very fluid. And as at now, that is the next frontier that people with proprietary ideas, guess what? Intellectual property does not protect something that is here. You cannot exploit. An investor will not invest on something that is here, right? To the extent that you can reduce it and condense it on paper, then it begins taking up its own life. I always tell people this: every idea has its own life form. If you give yourself to your idea, that idea will begin to take shape, that idea will begin to metamorphose, and actually now you'll begin to form and structure the green future. The green future as at now is still very fluid, and it still gives us tremendous opportunity to craft it with our ideas and own the extent to which we have crafted. Faha?
Okay, so you have Raphael asking, how do you know that your idea is proprietary? That's an interesting one.
Raphael, the mere fact it's your idea, my brother, it's proprietary. Proprietary simply means something that you can own. But more importantly, there's another side to the question that Raphael has asked. An idea in itself, right, only becomes proprietary once you've learned to unpackage that idea. An idea itself only becomes the word proprietary simply means something that you can own, right? What do you think that Uber owns? Uber owns the algorithm. Uber owns the model, the business model, right? Uber did not, they don't even manufacture cars. What does Airbnb own? Airbnb owns the algorithm. Airbnb owns the color, the font. What does Coca-Cola own? Coca-Cola owns that font. The extent to which you begin to unpack your idea, the extent to which you begin to reorganize and reshape your idea, then to that extent you will begin to identify things that are proprietary in your idea. How is it that the gentleman that came up with the proprietary recipe on KFC, did that gentleman invent chicken? That gentleman did not invent chicken. The gentleman only came up with a recipe. To that extent, the interaction of that recipe on cooking chicken, that gentleman owns that. The gentleman that came up with shoes, Nike, that gentleman did not create anything. To the infrastructure that they have built around Nike shoe, then they own the Nike trade and they own the design around creating Nike shoes. Raphael, my friend, to the extent you give yourself in unpacking your idea and in better understanding your idea, you'll begin to notice those components that you can actually own. And you can actually say, Dr. Dre, right? Did Dr. Dre actually manufacture headphones? The only thing that Dr. Dre contributed to manufacturing of headphones is the mastering and the way Dr. Dre masters his music and that punch. And so the only thing Dr. Dre sold to Nike, to the company that manufactures that headphone is the name Dre, Beats with Dre. The extent that you give yourself to your idea, the extent you begin to understand it, and to the extent you'll begin to identify unique components. Yes, Faha.
All right. So we have my last question. If I'm a startup, how do I go about managing my intellectual property as I move toward different stage of the businesses?
Beautiful question. Beautiful question. Uh, Let me use this analogy. I've been a parent. I've been a dad for a while now, and whenever from the date a child is conceived to, I don't know, the age of 2, they are what they call milestones that are expected, right? They are milestones. Equally in entrepreneurship, the moment you've conceived an idea, there is an
Yeah.
expected milestone that you as an entrepreneur ought to carry yourself. If you read the story of WhatsApp, it's a fundamental story that I always tell people that I interact with in the tech space. They are saying that when they were talking about WhatsApp and they said, hey, this name is unique. If you read that story, they're saying the following day, they went and registered WhatsApp Inc. In Africa, is the other way around. We'll talk about it, we will code, and then in the process of coding, we are like, did we register it? And we're like, no, we didn't register. Now we run to register it, and then you find that someone has registered it. As an entrepreneur, there is, in as much as it is not laid down procedure, but as an entrepreneur, the first instance that you as a startup, you're going about your business is, one, am I bringing something that doesn't exist? Am I bringing a solution that doesn't exist? If I'm coming up with a solution that doesn't exist, then you're an industrialist. An industrialist, and this is contrary to what we have been thinking for a long now, an industrialist is not any person with a huge portfolio. No. An industrialist is that individual that has come up with a product, a service, or a value proposition that has put in place an entirely new distribution channels. If you can develop a product that product comes and puts in place an entirely new distribution channel, then you're an industrialist. Let me give you this example, Faha, if you may allow me. We have money. The rest of the world, they're using plastic money. Kenya is one of those countries in the world that if you have plastic money, chances are you might not even get service. Chances are there are places you'll go into Kenya today and people will laugh at you with plastic money. But if you go with mobile money, then you'll get service anywhere in Kenya. So Kenya is actually the uptake of plastic money is very minimal, but the uptake on mobile money, the individual that developed that software, that
Right.
individual had put in place an entirely new supply chain. that individual, that solution that the gentleman was bringing is actually an industrial product. So as a startup, begin by asking yourself this question: this thing that I'm coming up with, is it something that will plug into an existing market? If it plugs into an existing market, then you begin to ask yourself, what is unique about the way I'm going about providing this solution? What is unique about the way I'm going and I'm structuring my offering? As an entrepreneur, you should actually begin now to appreciate that word offering. What am I offering? I could be selling, where we live, there are like 10 butcheries, right? And every butcher at the end of the day will sell. It's because every butcher has brought in their unique aspect in how they're selling meat. They're selling commodity. So as a startup, begin by asking yourself this fundamental question: whatever I'm bringing, does it exist? No, it doesn't exist. Then either do I bring it and mirror it on what already exists, so that to that extent I can have a point of bridge so that people can actually get oriented in what I'm providing, or if that thing that I'm already doing, if you're in textile, not unless we develop another way of coming up with the clothes. We are either coming up with clothes from cotton or sisal fiber or wool, right? If you can come up with how we can get clothing from stones, that is an entirely new industry. So, as a startup, as an entrepreneur, regardless of what you're selling, begin by asking yourself those fundamental questions. Is it something that is new? Yes. Then, how do I go about it? And that's why I advised from the onset that as an entrepreneur, your biggest friend moving forward in your jurisdiction, try and find an intellectual property lawyer, and they will help you to model business around your service. They will help you to model business around what you're thinking, because you could be looking at it from one angle, but as a practitioner, I know how to stretch it so that an industry can come out of what might look obvious. Yes, Maha.
All right. With that, insight and the passion that you share with us, I hope our viewers have benefited immensely. I would like to thank Mr. Ogwan for your time, for your passion, for your energy, and for your insight. I would also like to thank the Opportunity Desk team who's running behind the technical facilities for us. And you can also send the questions and feedback for this webinar on our Twitter handles. And we would also like to have your ideas for our next webinars, the speakers you want to see, and what kind of content you want us to produce. And until next time, I would like to thank Mr. Ogwan and thank you, viewers, for joining us. And we'll see
Thank
you
you very
again next
much.
time. Have a good weekend, all of you. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.